Well, very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're joined by Pathogen Reduction Solutions, which some of you may recall were the headline sponsors at our recent IPC conference in Birmingham back in April. Launched in 2020 at the height of the pandemic, Pathogen Reduction Solutions Limited is a pioneering IAQ technology development and engineered solutions business that's established to transform the way that we manage airborne pathogen risk in indoor environments. PRS is now seeing strong interest in the technology application within 4 targeted areas, in addition to healthcare, in offices and large buildings, cruise lines and other marine platforms, and the indoor agriculture sector. Now, all of these sectors are seeking to manage their indoor air quality for the long term, whether that be to protect occupants from airborne viral pathogens such as COVID, TB, measles and the common flu, to name just a few, but also to protect crops from airborne fungi, pathogens that can heavily impact on crop yields. With several patents pending and having tested and verified efficacy in a world-class BSL-3 lab with live viruses, PRS inactivates airborne pathogens within a fraction of a second, travelling through the air handling systems. Now, their proprietary UVC-based technology is practically complementary, applied in HVAC retrofits, as well as in new builds and across most air handling system types. So, and finally, as you'd expect from an innovation-driven technology business, PRS provides sustained economic and environmental benefits relative to conventional alternatives that all HVAC systems must ultimately deliver, significantly reducing building energy costs and, importantly, carbon footprints. So today's webinar seeks to broaden the understanding of airborne pathogen risk and how to manage it. And to that end, we're delighted to introduce Rob's fellow panelists, who many of you will probably already know. We've got subject matter experts Frank Mills, who's an NHS consultant, and Professor Tony Fisher, who's consultant clinical scientist at Liverpool University. The format for today is going to be a 30 to 40 minute discussion that's going to be led by the panel, and that will focus on 4 or 5 key questions. And after that, we'll invite questions from you out in the chat rooms via the chat function. So please feel free to post any questions during the discussion on the chat function. PRS have kindly agreed to answer all the questions directly while we're on the webinar, but if they don't get answered today, they will be answered directly once the webinar is finished. So let's start with some introductions, and if the panel would kindly introduce themselves briefly, please, for the benefit of our delegates, and we'll start off with Rob.
Well, thanks, Tony. My name is Robert McCullough, and I have a background in mechanical engineering and physics. And then within mechanical engineering, I sort of specialize in what are called the thermosciences. That's heat transfer, fluid mechanics, and thermodynamics. And within the area of physics, I've been working in optics, spectroscopy, radiation transport, and plasma physics. So I've had a very fun and fruitful career working at the intersection of those 2 disciplines, starting with a solar energy project just out of graduate school and working over the years for various government agencies on the development of optical systems, a lot of them involving very high photon densities. And then finally retired and got interested in biology, which I never studied in school, and started a little company called Biophotonic Systems in 2017 with the intent of looking at the interaction of photonics with biological systems, with life. And in 2020, at the outset of the pandemic, we sort of directed our interest in that area into using ultraviolet C technology for the mitigation of COVID. And I've been working with Pathogen Reduction Solutions since then to develop our PRS system. And we'll talk a little bit more about the physics of that during some of the questions. Thank you. So on to Tony.
Rob, thanks very much. I must say what a great privilege, and I hope it's going to be a fun talking with colleagues over the next hour or so. My background's a strange one, really. I started off as a conventional medic, but then moved into healthcare science and went down the route of, a master's degree and a PhD and that kind of stuff, and then became a professional physicist and ended up working medical physics in Liverpool. My NHS career has been mainly research and teaching. But I joined the Chief Scientific Officer's office, Professor Sue Hill, with Professor Sue Hill and Angela Douglas at the start of the pandemic, provide some expertise in the physical sciences, and worked on in some of the issues we had in the Nightingale hospitals, then worked on the deployment of the mobile LAMP slash PCR testing system that we rolled out across most of England. My recent contribution to supporting the pandemic and post-pandemic has been looking at the exploitation of modern technologies in providing safe, sanitized ventilation in healthcare spaces. I've worked with some great people over the last 24 months, and sparing your blushes, Frank, one of those is Frank Mills, and he's going to speak to you next.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this panel. I think this is going to be a very interesting webinar, and I look forward to doing it. My name is Frank Mills. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've been in construction for about 50 years, so I put myself down as an applications engineer. Other people invent things, and we engineers put them together and install them into buildings to work. I'm a fellow of the CIBSE, a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and a member of ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating and Air Conditioning Engineers. So in March 2020, I was on the steering group for the ventilation standard for hospitals, that's HTMO3, and we had a meeting in London and signed it off in the middle of March. And a week later, COVID really hit us quite badly, and that got postponed for about a year. HTMO3 was eventually published as it was stood in the beginning of March, actually, with a small paragraph that talked about COVID. So the document is really as it was at that occasion, and is really quite up to date. It mentions air cleaning, which is what we're going to discuss today. At that time, I then worked with the CIBSE to form a COVID task force, and we've published information on the CIBSE website. I formed a COVID task force at the IMechE, and we've been working to do webinars and training. I also joined the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force, which has produced over 600 pages of information available on the ASHRAE website as a dashboard-driven infographic. So thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Right, well, thanks very much for that, gentlemen. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting debate webinar today. So let's kick off with the first of our questions. And let me start with Rob. Rob, how real is the airborne transmission of pathogens, and with particular reference to particle size and droplet suspension?
Well, I think that's a real interesting question, Paul, that a lot of us in various places for the last 2 years have been asking. And if you go back and reflect over the guidance presented by the CDC and other government agencies, the airborne mechanism sort of developed over time. It was not very seriously thought about in the beginning, and now I think with the onset of the emphasis on ventilation, it's becoming real. But I wanted to talk about it a little bit from the physics standpoint, since that's my background. That's how I like to think about things. And I wanted to sort of open up with the concept of what a terminal velocity is, and that's basically if you jump out of an airplane, you're parachuting. You'll gradually accelerate towards the Earth until the drag forces from the air offset the gravity forces and you reach a constant speed. That's called terminal velocity. So why do I talk about this? Well, when a person is sick with COVID or something like that, and they cough or they sneeze or they even exhale, they project a series of small aerosols or droplets into the atmosphere, the largest of which are around a millimeter or so, and they go all the way down to below a micron. And you say, well, what's the terminal velocity of these different sized particles? And you find out that larger particles, like 100 microns, have a terminal velocity of about a meter per second. So in a couple of seconds, they're going to fall to the ground and become basically not a threat. As you go down into smaller and smaller particle size, and when you get down to something on the order of the size of a bacteria or a fungus or a very small droplet, say a 1 micron diameter, the terminal velocity of a particle that small is on the order of a tenth of a millimeter per second, a tenth of a millimeter every second. What does that mean? That means it doesn't fall out of the air. So those very, very small aerosols will stay in the air and be carried with the air in your room or wherever through whatever system you're engaged with. Now that's a little bit of a worrying problem. The other thing you need to ask is, so you have these aerosols and they have pathogens in them at that very small size. Can the pathogens live a long time? How long does a pathogen live once it's been expelled into the atmosphere? And the truth is, we really don't know the answer to that question. It depends upon a lot of things. But there's evidence of lifetimes anywhere from a minute or two up to several days or even a month, depending upon the type of pathogen. So the reason that question was of interest to me is that if you have a system where you're introducing particles that essentially become the same as the air, and those particles can remain viable for a significant amount of time, isn't that a pretty serious threat? And do people realize that? And so I'll pass that on as an introduction to any of the other panelists that might want to comment.
So let's bring Tony in on that then, Tony. And how has the perception of this changed over time? So before, during, and post-COVID threat, has it changed?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we started off, we had to assume that the transmission routes could be from surfaces, between people, touch, or airborne. And it only took a few months really before we realised that the predominant transmission risk was going to be via the airborne route. And I like what Rob just said there, the appreciation of how these particles have the potential to move in healthcare spaces depends on a load of stuff, but principally their particle size, because particle size relates to their mass, and mass relates to how they're going to move around. The small particles, as Rob said, move around like gas particles. They're completely buoyant, and the heavy particles tend to precipitate, and we call that stoked precipitation, gravity, you know, dropping a tennis ball on the floor. Why is this so significant? Well, the gaseous particles, you can imagine just floating around. What about the heavy particles? What about these aerosol generated particles, the AGPs that we were so worried about, you know, 2 or 3 months into the pandemic? Principal sources would be, the wet cough, the wet sneeze in clinical procedures, all types of endoscopy in dentistry, a very, very big potential issue. So a lot of work has gone on by some very, very smart people at looking at the dynamics of these heavier particles as they tend not to float, as they tend to have momentum when they're propelled from the site of generation, how far they will travel. So the academic world has done a lot of work on the computational fluid dynamics of working out exactly what happens to these particles. And one complication that really makes things so difficult is that a large wet particle, 500 microns, expelled from, I don't know, the mouth of a sneezing person, or comes out of the mouth of a patient receiving dental treatment. It's large, but it's got a large surface area. So what starts with a large particle can evaporate very quickly and becoming a small particle. So if we look at something like an AGP scenario, we can't just think they're heavy particles, we'll deal with them as heavy particles. These heavy particles containing viruses and bacteria can become sufficiently light, become buoyant, can be transmitted as gas molecules over very, very large distances. They can get caught up in adequately designed healthcare spaces, travel large distances, and be highly persistent. Over to you, Paul.
So listening to that, and Frank, let's bring you in on this. Do you think that healthcare and IPC communities are taking the threat seriously enough now? And if they are they doing enough about it?
Well, if I come in there, I'd say yes, they are certainly taking it seriously. We found at your conference in Birmingham and the conference in Edinburgh, there were a lot of people there very interested, and the presentations were excellent. However, we're not moving anywhere near fast enough. It was a rather of a shock to me to discover in the past year that 55% of our hospitals in the UK don't even meet our own basic standard, HTMO3. And that was before COVID, and we don't really have a plan in place to do much about that. So I think we really have to take that seriously. I'd like to refer to the paper that Catherine Noakes and her colleagues published, the Paradigm Shift, and it really compared where we are now with air to where the UK was with water back in the 1850s, where water was pretty dirty and people got sick. And at that time, they said we really must improve our water supplies, which we did. However, we've never really done much about air. And I travel to the States quite a lot, and there's a fundamental cultural difference between us in the UK. We refer to outside air as fresh air, meaning it's nice and fresh, it's clean. And it could be, of course, but it might be really quite dirty. But we can't tell, it all looks the same. Whereas in the States, they think outdoor air is dirty air. And when they bring it into a building, they filter it. And rather shocked sometimes to hear that we open windows and allow it straight in. But I think we do have to up our game and really realise that air is not clean. It's not just oxygen and nitrogen, as I was told at school. It's got rather a lot, in fact, millions of very, very small particles that I can't see floating around, and some of them are harmful.
So let's bring Tony in again then, Tony, on the back of that. What technologies are now available to mitigate airborne disease transmissions?
Okay, well, what Frank alluded to, didn't mention explicitly, the way that we tend to look at ventilation of all spaces and buildings is how many changes of room air we can achieve or are achieved, either actively or passively within a space. The more air, old air you can shift out, and the more new air you can bring in, obviously, the better. Frank made the point very distressingly that so many healthcare spaces in the UK simply don't have a minimum number of these ACHs that we require. So what we can do, if we can't provide upgrades, massive upgrades to our heating and ventilation structures, maybe we can sanitize the air that we're kind of stuck with. And I think this is where PRS is looking at, isn't it? So rather than change all the air all the time as often as possible, is the way to go forward probably is to change enough of it and then sanitize the air left behind. And we are talking of maybe retaining 80% of the air with a highly efficient air sanitization system. So the effective air changes per hour are many times greater than the physical air changes. And I think that's excellent for post-fitting to existing implementations, but also must so influence the design of where we go in the future. The actual technology we're tending to use, ultraviolet technology at certain wavelengths is very, very good, and in germicidal and viral inactivation scenario. Of course, there are filters, and there are fans of filters, and there are people who are against filters. We have HEPA filters, don't we? They're on my Dyson vacuum cleaner at home, and they're very effective at moving small particles, and will take out viral particles not by filtration but by absorption. So ultraviolet, HEPA filters, and emerging technologies. These emerging technologies, including electrical arc systems, spontaneous ozone, plasma ionization. But the two big players at the moment are UV, UVC, it's particular wavelengths within the electromagnetic spectrum that's particularly effective, and filters. So 1, 2, and then put them in combination. And they're the three that I think the panel are most focused on at the moment.
And your thoughts on that, Rob?
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement. I think that, ventilation, which has been promoted a lot recently, is an extremely effective method because you're basically replacing the air that's been contaminated with fresh air. And ventilation is good if you have two conditions in place. And one Frank referred to, that the air is really fresh. You don't always know what's lurking in the air that you're bringing in. And the other aspect is a green aspect, and that is it costs money to heat or cool or humidify or dehumidify outside air to bring it into the same conditions as on the inside. So I think that you look at other technologies, and filtration is very effective. Does cost you a bit of power to push the air through the filters depending upon how good they are. But filters basically are very effective at removing pathogens of all sizes. If you look at the ways that you can mitigate the pathogens, or as we like to say, kill them, there are 5 basic areas that you could think of: optical, chemical, mechanical, electrical, and nuclear. And of those 5 methods, probably mechanical would obviously include filtration, but the optical and the chemical routes are the ones that are most commonly being looked at today. And like Tony said, in optical, we're interested in wavelengths that can actually disrupt life. And that starts at about 300 nanometers in the UV, which is just about of the area where the ozone cuts off the outside radiation from outer space, protecting life on Earth, and goes down to about 200 nanometers, which is where oxygen cuts off and prevents transmission. So in that region between 200 and 280 nanometers is what we call the UVC. You can obviously do it with shorter wavelengths, X-rays and so on, but that becomes a kind of a problematic thing too. So UVC is a really nice optical range to work in. photons transmit through the atmosphere, and life on Earth has gotten very used to not having large fluxes of that thanks to our ozone layer. Now, if you look at chemical methods, those basically boil down to generating oxidants or weak plasmas, ions, and so on. And those will definitely also kill viruses and toxins. But the problem is getting those chemical species dispersed into the air. You're limited by the process of diffusion for those molecules moving through the air to get to the viruses. And typical diffusion constants are on the order of a centimeter squared per second, which means that if you put a little bit of that ion or that oxidant in the air, it's going to diffuse very, very slowly unless you have some sort of mixing. And so there's advantages to both, but we chose the UVC route because in PRS we were challenged with the prospect of how do we kill these pathogens in the amount of time we have available inside an internal heating system. And in those heating systems, the air is moving at a very high velocity, like 3 meters a second or 6 meters a second. And so if you have a device in there, you will only have on the order of a tenth of a second to kill it. And so you have to generate very intense UVC fields. And we think that's the most effective way for mitigating viruses in large buildings.
Frank, let's bring you in here. Which, in your opinion, do you believe to work most effectively? And when you give us the answer, why?
Well, I'm an engineer that looks for an integrated approach, really. So I think we definitely need some filters because, a lot of the dust and dirt that's coming in, they're big particles. We want to get them out of the system. For example, UVC lamp works effectively until it gets its surfaces covered with dust and dirt. So we don't want them on there. So I would think we'd want a G4 filter or maybe something slightly better to keep the air clean of dust and dirt. But I wouldn't go as far as HEPA filtration. I would then perhaps use the UVC device to actually sterilize the air as it goes back, and we could get 99.9% or better cleaning on that kind of system if we do it properly. It's also key that we have the air changes that Tony mentioned. Just putting a device like this in a room in the corner and expecting it to do its business isn't good enough if we don't churn the air around, mix it, bring the dirty air back in, sterilize it and clean it back in to the system. So I think with HEPA filtration, I know it works. My concern is, well, first of all, I should say it's not really recommended in HTMO3 anywhere apart from in a pharmacy. So HEPA filtration isn't in there at the moment. But it does talk about the use of UVC or HEPA in circumstances where COVID came as a risk. I think my concern with HEPA would be a practical one in that it's fitted properly and tested. If any air bypasses the filter, its efficiency goes from 99.9% down to about 2%, because any air leakage around the edge really just destroys its effect. It also will get dirty and ends up as a bit of a bio bomb. You've collected a lot of mucky stuff on that. It's stopped basically everything. You've got to get it out and get it into a bag and remove it from a potentially occupied area without contaminating the space or people in it. All these things are possible, of course, but it's a bit more difficult than a UVC, which does actually deactivate viruses and kills bacteria. So we know that air is actually really sterile. But it's a situation. I just want to touch on the other things that Rob mentioned. There are other methods of cleaning air, but in the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force, we park them in what we call emerging technologies because there's not enough evidence really that they're safe with people, but they can be used. So, for example, ozone will sterilise air, and we use ozone for cleaning ambulances in the UK. But we plug it into the ambulance at night and the team go home. They don't sit in the ambulance because if they did, they'd be dead by the morning. So these kind of other technologies could be used, but not where people are used. So the ASHRAE recommendation was to steer clear of those devices sprayed in the air until we know that they're safe. And if there's any doubt, then don't use them where people are around. So the two key features for me would be a UVC and filtration of the air to keep the dust and dirt out, and a fan that's big enough to give you the number of air changes you want, which looks to be around 10 air changes an hour.
Rob, just like to bring you in here. when we decided that we were going to put this webinar together, we did a delegate survey. We've had a great feedback from that survey. You've had a look at it. What conclusions have you drawn from that survey?
Yeah, well, let me address that in just a second. I wanted to add something to that very important point that Frank brought up, and that is the fact that all these methods that kill viruses and bacteria and fungi and pathogens will also damage human cells. I mean, the life in general is based on cellular biology, and anything you have to kill one will kill another. And one of the main differences between chemical methods and optical methods is that we can contain these powerful photons in our device. We've had a lot of work to make sure none of them leak out. You really can't do that with any kind of an oxygen or ion. Once you put it into the air, it's in the system just like the particles, and it will propagate to all the people that were breathing in that air, and possibly like with ozone and the hydroxyls and all, they have negative impacts. But yeah, Frank, the survey was very interesting. One of the questions that we asked from the science standpoint was, what were the major concerns? What were the major pathogens that were of concern in hospitals? And there were, I think they listed up to 10, but the top 5, as I remember, of course, COVID hits in there one, but MRSA is also one of the serious concerns. C. diff, norovirus. Norovirus is a serious problem, and not only just hospitals, but on places like cruise ships. And then finally, things like tuberculosis, which we've known the airborne mechanism has been established for years and years. And so I thought it was very interesting that those were the five things that came up. The other thing, which is sort of non-scientific, was they surveyed the people and asked them how much training they thought they were receiving, and most people said not enough. And they asked them and said, well, how much financial resources do you have to deal with this? And almost all of them said, we don't have any. So that's the key message, and perhaps we could talk about that a little bit later when we get more into how we solve indoor air quality systems.
Thanks very much for that. Sticking with you, Rob, how do we enable testing of the various methods to measure performance against the real pathogens, and not only that, verify what's effective and what's not? I mean, some of the market claims that are out there.
That's a great question, Paul, and we have lots of inputs. I saw Frank had a point to make on the last one. Can we let him jump in here? Frank, did you have something?
It was me, actually, Rob.
Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm just
going to help colleagues with a bit of transatlantic speak there. We tend to spell out MRSA as MRSA. MRSA might miss a few people in this audience, Rob.
Okay, thanks for that. So, yeah, Paul, back to your question about how we enable testing. At PRS, we've always taken the position, and we still hold this very strongly, that the only way to really qualify a system is to test it with live pathogens, live viruses that are pathogenic, in other words, cause problems. And so to that end, we spent a lot of time and effort trying to locate a BSL-3 laboratory to test our device. And we tested our devices at full operating capacity with 3 viruses. We tested them with measles, with H1N1A, which is related to the common flu, and with COVID. And we got spectacular results, very high kill ratios with all those. Unfortunately, that testing costs a lot of money, and it's not always accessible to everybody. So the question is, can you use a surrogate pathogen in a device and test it? And theoretically, the answer is yes. The mechanics of killing these pathogens is very simple. It depends upon the dosage of energy, how many photons you hit them with, and their susceptibility to being killed, which is summarized in what's called a K factor or a killing factor. And these K factors vary over 3 orders of magnitude, at least, depending upon the ambient conditions. The type of virus. Spores are much harder to kill than bacteria or viruses in general. And so it's very conceivable that you could use a surrogate pathogen if you knew its K factor, and you knew the K factor of the series, like anthrax or COVID or whatever you're trying to kill. Unfortunately, even though this data has been acquired for close to 100 years, people have been measuring kill factors on various pathogens. The value of the K factor depends strongly upon the environment, the background, and the pathogen. So in order to make a surrogate viable, you would really need to test it under identical conditions with your device to a real pathogen. And then once you had the ratio of those effects, you could extrapolate that simple test. So I know Tony's been using a bacteria called Micrococcus luteus for his tests. The Asheray people specified testing a type of Aspergillus and another bacterium. But to date, in my opinion, there isn't a solid scientific link between that. When you're designing a system, you go into the literature and you pull out the K values that you think are relevant to what you're trying to deal with. You base it on that. The real science of linking them two together rigorously, to my mind, has not been done, but we're starting to move in that direction, and we hope to have some results in the near future.
We've got some very interesting questions coming in, and I think I'd like to get a couple of those in before we move on with what we're doing. Jackie Russell has put a question in asking for advice on dealing with challenges in MRI scan rooms. Can the panel advise? And also, can the panel comment on the use of HINS light?
I can certainly pick up on some very successful installations we've made in a number of radiology suites. Did I hear correctly? MR room, I think you said. We've been advocating the use of portable UV-based air scrubbers from a number of manufacturers, and we've been. I say we. This is the Office of the Chief Scientific Officer and the project that's been sponsored to run at the University of Liverpool, where I am. We've looked at the verification and validation of these portable devices, and we've been able to recommend with confidence installing these into a number of radiology healthcare spaces. I just like to use this opportunity, Paul, if I can, to pick up on what Rob said there, that on the NHS side, if you like, we've been looking at some of these portable UVC devices and some other technologies. Using our surrogate, which is Micrococcus luteus, which is by and large non-pathogenic. Well, why have we done this? Well, there's a real history here. So that when we first, the world, if you like, started to respond by providing technological solutions and mitigations to the C-19 epidemic, so many very, very dodgy devices appeared on the market. It was really quite frightening. Some of the kit that was out there, and the most outrageous claims were being made. And colleagues working at the coalface had no idea whether these devices were good or bad. So our work was to provide verification that the engineering was good and validation that they were bioeffective. Well, we started on that work, maybe 16 months ago, and found that the IPC community weren't at all interested in the engineering and physics verification of these devices. They kind of basically wanted to know, what's the biovalidation? Do these devices work, or are they just boxes powered by snake oil? So we looked for a surrogate, and this surrogate that we chose had to be non-pathogenic, and it could be used effectively to provide indices of sanitization in non-Cat3, Cat2 testing laboratories. It's something that can be done by educated, careful, well-meaning scientists opposed to specialist microbiologists. So we set up a protocol that was sponsored by NHS Supply Chain to test all devices coming into the NHS by using this bug, Micrococcus luteus. Interestingly, it's one of the first ones that Fleming found because it just seemed to fly in through the window. Now, we know a lot about this bacterium. It is very robust against UVC and A and B, actually. And the cosmetic industry use this a lot to test their sun creams. So there's quite a good literature on how this bug is inactivated or killed, bactericidal, by UV light. So that is the standard NHS test at the moment. So a piece of kit that wants to come into the NHS comes into the NHS testing laboratory, and we use that surrogate, and an index is produced of the bioefficacy. And what Rob said is absolutely bang on. It's a surrogate, it's a good engineering marker, it makes sure these devices actually do work. How it relates to those pathogens that are in the healthcare space at the moment that he mentions, that's the piece of work that needs to be done. So at the moment, we've got this very robust bioefficacy measure in the NHS for these bits of kit which support the verification. We now need to map that against the pathogens of concern. Rob.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to wanted to add to that a little bit, in that the K factors that I mentioned earlier. If you look at the K factor with the best data we have for Tony's Micrococcus luteus, it's about 8 times harder to kill than a COVID virus. Okay, so it's roughly 8 times harder to kill. So if your system passes the test with Micrococcus luteus, even though we haven't got the hard link, the chances are very, very good it's going to take care of something like a COVID. Now, something like Aspergillus or anthrax, that's another matter. That's about 3 times harder to kill than Micrococcus luteus. But I just wanted to mention that we have plans to test our device in the same facility in which we tested the live virus with Micrococcus luteus, and hopefully we'll be able to get K values for both species in the environmental conditions that we believe are important.
Yeah. And the important thing there is to map your test there against what we now use in the NHS.
Right.
The NHS can say, okay, these are not the extrapolations we can make, but the interpolations we can make against the whole spectrum of sensitivity. I am very surprised, actually, Rob, in a hand-waving sort of way, that you think that SARS-CoV-2 is only 8 times more sensitive to UV light. I would have thought it would, in realistic conditions of RH and temperature in the air, not on surfaces and not in liquid form, they'd be far, far more sensitive. How do you justify that claim?
Well, without getting too deep into the science here, the K factor that we use for COVID is 0.2 meters squared per joules. Measles is about 0.1, which we use as our standard to design our systems to. And the numbers that I've dug up for years, and I've only done a couple of searches on it, but it looked to me like Micrococcus luteus K factors are 0.03. So take the ratio of 0.2 to 0.03. That's about 8 in my rough calculation.
I would say that's comfortable, but we've got to do some definitive science on that.
And hopefully we'll get that. We'll have those numbers within a month or two. So we're working on it.
Okay, gentlemen, we have to move on. I'm afraid. I'm sure we could go on for this discussion all day, but let me go to the next question. If we now think about real-world application of the technologies, my next question to the panel is: how do we engineer indoor air quality air sanitation system to provide effective coverage throughout the entire building? And I suppose I'm asking Rob that question.
So I think the important way to frame that question is to ask what an indoor air quality system is. And to my mind, an indoor air quality system is an extremely complicated system. As a system, it has various components. Obviously, the air handlers, the distributors, the filters are part of it. Air purifiers are also part of it. And the mechanics of distributing or changing the air in a room through the registers or the vents or whatever you want to call them is the third part of it. So when you talk about making an effective indoor air quality system, the objective presumably is to make the air quality in the entire system acceptable for human occupation. That means if we want it to be effective, it has to clean all the air all the time. You can build the best little UVC box or ozone box in the world, but if it only scrubs 10% of the room because the air conditioning and the flow is not adequate, you haven't done it. So I think this is an area where we're seeing a lot of modeling research. People are running Navier-Stokes fluid mechanics solvers to try and predict how air flows through buildings, and that's all good, I think, for advanced design. But I would say that there are other ways to do it, and the simplest way to think about it is just how do you keep the air in a room circulating so that whatever device you have reaches all the air. The old-fashioned upper air fan that you saw in the tropics that just slowly mixes the air is a good way to do, is an example of how you might think about augmenting different types of technologies. Now, obviously, there's certain situations where if you have a concentrated source of pathogen in one part of the room, you don't want to be mixing the air. You want a local device. So there's room for filtration, there's room for centralized UVC systems, and there's room for standalone UVC systems and filters too. And the thing is, the systems analysis, or the systems engineer that does the IAQ systems analysis, needs to readdress this problem with those metrics that I mentioned as the objective. That's my opinion. And again, I don't want to trivialize this. It's a very, very complicated mechanical problem to solve the flow through a building. Frank?
Well, we've got Frank sitting there listening patiently. Let's bring you in, Frank. Your thoughts on that?
No, Rob's description there was excellent, and we have this phrase called ventilation effectiveness. So we can pump all the air you like into a room, but if it isn't effective, then we've wasted our time. So the two extremes are really dilution. We put a lot of air in, mix it all up, and then whatever contaminant in there is diluted down to a safe level, and we keep extracting that out and putting more stuff back in, more clean air. The other extreme would be purging, where we know where the contaminant is and we sort of basically push the clean air in one side and push that out the other. But as Rob said, getting the mix right is important. So we tend to be identifying where we think the problem is if we know where it is. So in the dental surgery, for example, we knew the patient was a problem. The patient's got his mouth wide open, he's breathing out all sorts of stuff. And on one side, he's got the dentist, the other side, the dental nurse. And we have to protect them and indeed protect him. So we came up with a solution there where we push the air in from above with a swell diffuser down across the patient to low level and take that across at low level into an air cleaning device. It was a UVC device in that situation, which then cleaned it and put it back into the air at high level and mixed with the fresh air coming into the room. So that was effective. And I think what you need to do in all your projects is to look in this particular room, what is the issue? Where's the pollutant likely to be? With COVID, it's going to walk in with a person, but there could be other problems, and then see what is the most effective way of dealing with it.
Excellent. I just want to keep you on for a second, Frank. You were part of the working group that published the recent report that was released a couple of weeks ago by the Royal Academy of Engineers called Building Infection Resilient Environments. Perhaps you could provide a brief summary of that report that you were involved in.
Yeah, certainly. The report was actually done in two stages. So stage one, which was published in June 2021, really looked at the issue of health and safety in buildings. And surprise, surprise, although our building regulations do focus on safety quite well, they didn't really look at healthy buildings. So we have a lot of issues. So the Academy have moved on, the Royal Academy have moved on to a second phase, which was published in June, 15th of June this year. And it looked for a systems approach and a case for change. And it really identified major problems in the way we deal with buildings. And it's really thrown out the challenge to us all, really, to come up with a better approach. It did because it was advising government, it looked at money, and it came up with the fact that if we have another big influenza type pandemic come our way, another COVID, it's costing us around £23 billion a year. So enormous amounts of money involved here. And it's really saying that there's a lot to be done. It also identified, and I think we'll talk about this one separately, the fact that if we can get this right and do better ventilation, we can probably reduce our energy and our carbon footprint at the same time. But it really threw the challenge out to us to develop systems. We've got to get the strategy right, the design right. We've then got to build the buildings properly and hand them over so people know what they're doing. In use, we have to monitor them all the time to make sure they're still working properly. And we have to upgrade them from time to time with better, newer equipment. Equipment wears out, a bit like running a car. You wouldn't dream of keeping a car going for 10 years without looking at it, but we tend to do that in buildings. So to take the whole thing really seriously from start to finish to make sure that we're providing a healthy environment. Now that report is available from the Royal Academy website, and it let 3 subcontracts to other people, which are also available on there, which provide the detailed information behind the report. Well, thank you, Rob. That's the report. And if you go to that site, you'll be able to get the 3 even bigger and more detailed sub-reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Very good. There's a quick point I want to pick up on here. That's one of the questions that's come into the chat room from George Adams. He says, with the huge impact of COVID on societies and business, why is there not a huge response to protect people in all buildings, bearing in mind the serious costs involved when we suffer future pandemics, which is what you've just been talking about? Anybody?
Well, I think it's interesting when we looked at pricing the addition of PRS into large, big, shiny buildings. We were looking at some kind of metric to give these guys a feeling of how large and how painful the investment would have to be in order to protect the building. When you run through the rough numbers and estimate what it would cost to retrofit large buildings with a PRS system, it's about the same as the amount of money you pay for having a coffee and a bun every day for every person in the building. So the point is, these costs are fairly small compared to the overall capital investment, and the also even the in-house utility investments. So my point there, I would say that they should be putting these in right away. The cost is not that big compared to just any other air conditioning component you can think of. Frank, you had a point there.
Yes, I totally agree with you. But actually, Rob, what you may not know, here in the UK, we talk about our hospitals, they are full fresh air all the time. So our standard rate of ventilation for clinical areas is 10 air changes an hour. And for ward areas, 6 air changes an hour. They're minimum levels, by the way. So we are encouraged to do more than that. So that is causing us an enormous cost in terms of energy and a very high
Yes.
level of carbon. So I've done some projects recently where I've found that the cost of this equipment that we're putting in, whether it's just some boxes in a room, some recirculating device, or whether it's in the ductwork as part of the plant, covered in the first year, because we were able to recirculate a lot more of our air, let's say 70 or 80%, as you do in the US. And if we can do that, the savings are enormous. In fact, if we were to roll out this solution across the NHS, across all our hospitals, we would reduce the carbon emissions by a third. A third of all hospital carbon emissions are down to the fact that we use full fresh air ventilation. So I'm saying this is almost self-funding. I mean, if you can find anything in life where you invest money and you double it in a year, that's what a payback in a year is basically doubling your money in a year. Wow, come on, we can do it. I'm a simple engineer. I do this stuff, but I don't know where the money comes from. But crikey, someone needs to come up with it. We can start saving lots of money and reducing our carbon footprint right today.
I think that's an interesting. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, okay, Frank. While you're prophesizing on this for saving carbon, which is just excellent, I'd make 2 points. One, this is not esoteric technology that's 10 years ahead. It's available absolutely now, and our work together has kind of shown this. But yes, there's the carbon saving, but the carbon saving is on the back of meeting HTMO3. It's on the back of providing the healthcare environments that really we should be required to do anyway. So they appear orthogonal when in fact they're absolutely related. So it's a lot of bang per buck, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Royal Academy report also looked at this economic impact, which is massive, billions of pounds. And then the personal impact, people have missed their holiday or missed a train or whatever they've done. This is a big deal. It's disrupting our life quite badly. You go to the shops and there's no bread in or something like that. And that's because the delivery driver's called in sick. I don't know how we can live on with the level of sickness we're going. The idea that we were going to protect society when I think over 90% of the UK population have had COVID. It's just unbelievable, really. We haven't done very well, in my opinion. We need this ventilation in to just keep these levels down and allow us to return to being a normal society. So I haven't put any money on the hospital-acquired infections, Tony, or the impact on society. But if we were to factor that in, and it's all a bit more nebulous, it's a bit hard to pin down, but it would be extremely cost effective, because none of us really want to find our football match cancelled or our show cancelled or our holiday cancelled. This is important stuff that we get this thing under control. So I think it's a no-brainer. We need to get on with it.
So can I just jump in there and listening to what you guys are saying, you're the experts, what's needed to accelerate the change that is needed? Is it policy change? We have to turn talk into action?
Okay, I can jump into the NHS there, and I say that the two communities within the healthcare that we need to have on board for this. One is the IPC community, infection control community, and of course there's facilities management. And I think this webinar is just emphasizing that those two groups of people just totally work together. But the controlling thing on both those is the finance, isn't it? Being realistic finance. And Frank makes such a persuasive argument for this. These mitigations we can put in to improve the health of our population comes with the benefits of the carbon saving. So it's self-financing. So it is with a lot of frustration I find it's proving a little bit slow at the moment, taking this technology forward. So conversations are to be had between IPC communities, facilities communities, and executive finance in hospitals to show that yes, it's a double win here. It's not esoteric, and there are many examples out now that come from Frank's group and my group in the UK where we've successfully implemented this technology.
Yeah, can I come in and just say we need an industry that can deliver at scale. There's been some excellent work done, as you know, Tony, and you've been involved with that, and Bob as well. But we, through the engineering institutions, are promoting more CPD education training of engineers so they know exactly how to deliver the right. And we're working with industries such as PRS here to come up with good, reliable products so it can be maintained and operated for years and years. This isn't a situation where you take a thing out of a box and run it for a couple of months and put it away again. This has got to become a permanent feature. So that's another challenge to us, is to make sure we deliver this year on year forever and maintain health and safety in buildings. But we are doing it, and it is covered in the Royal Academy report.
So there, we've got about 10 minutes to go, and we've still got time for questions. A question there for people in the audience: how does the audience suggest the IPC community can be convinced of the efficacy of UVC in combating the transmission of airborne pathogens? Rob, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to make a couple of points, and going back to the types of pathogens they're worried about. I think it's important to note that these pathogens have different origins and transmission mechanisms. For example, pathogens that affect your gut, like MRSA and C. diff, are going to be introduced into the environment in a much different way than upper respiratory pathogens like tuberculosis, COVID, and H1N1. So that's a factor that has to go into what we're talking about IAQ design. And it may couple into the design of some of the other sanitary systems too, through the use of vacuum toilets and technology like that. So it's a very complicated thing. With respect to how do we bring this stuff together? And I hear a lot of the discussion always revolves around finances, about how a corporation's ESG rating can be affected if they have healthy buildings. And and there's when you think about the cost of COVID to hospitals, I think just the cost of losing your staff alone in terms of operating costs would more than justify the expense of putting these in any situation. But ultimately, it's got to be about saving lives, and we need people to step up and go.
Looking at the comments that are coming in on the chat room, I'm sure you guys can see them as well. One from Sheila Patel: IPC community is on board. The stumbling factor is finance, which is basically what you guys have been saying. The technology needs to be more affordable. Fair comment?
No, I don't see that. I think the proper business case means that the affordability is very achievable. But my point has to come. It can't be IPC alone. It's got to be facilities and bring it together. So we have the benefits of good healthcare spaces in terms of respiratory, of airborne transmission per se, but also we're making a big contribution to the green agenda, and there's a lot of finance available throughout the UK for green agendas. So a bit of joined up thinking here. Maybe Frank, we should be working harder with the engineering institutions and to try and. Well, I suppose we have done, haven't we, really, with that document that we've just been talking about. Maybe we're not disseminating the knowledge there in a non-technical fashion that IPC community is happy with. Maybe today we've talked too much about photons and joules. Maybe we should talk more about some clinical evidence. And I shouldn't have talked about Micrococcus luteus. I should have talked about MRSA.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But in response to that question, I think there's a right price for these things. There's some really cheap units on the market. If you look on Amazon, you can get UVC cleaners for £100, but you're wasting your £100 because they probably don't work. I mean, I don't know all of those units, but in terms of an engineered system in the building, which is what this webinar is about, there is a price which has to be paid. I mean, you can look around and compete with different suppliers and different contractors to do the job. At the end of the day, it will have a cost against it, and it will have a cost to run it as well, of course. We've found that all that is returnable within, as I say, 12 months or maybe a bit longer in some situations, because we're saving energy if we're recirculating air where we haven't done beforehand. How you get your hands on that money, because the energy bill is paid by somebody else, is another matter, of course. But on balance, the owner of the building has got a lower energy cost. And by the way, I haven't factored in all of these big costs that come in October. So I'm told my house bill is going up to £3,000 according to BBC. So yeah, energy bills are getting higher. I don't think you can ask Bob this, but I don't think the cost of these units are going up at that rate.
No, and I think the one of the interesting points is that we've looked at some of the combinations of UVC and filtration, and our unit has a very minimal pressure drop through it. We believe that if you combine UVC with filtration, you might actually be able to drop the MERV level down from 13 to 9 or 19 to 13. And that would actually reduce the energy cost of pumping the air through the filters. So you may end up with another energy bonus in addition to the fact that you're not having to just replace the air all the time. So I think from a green standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. I guess what we need to see to answer the question that your viewer posed is some really detailed cost benefit analysis of these things, including all the ESG costs, all the lost opportunity costs. I think if those things were done by somebody who's a professional economic analyst, you would see very quickly that the cost benefit ratio is very small. The benefits are huge and the costs are not that much.
We're actually running rapidly out of time, but there is a question here I want to put to both Tony and Frank from Barry Patterson. Do the NHS know just how big a problem they have with contaminated air in the hospitals, and are there any published results? Let's go to Tony.
All right, I was frightened that question might come my way, Paul. But Barry, I know exactly why you're asking that question, and I know of so many pieces of work that are almost oven ready and ready to go and be published. At the moment, Barry, we work together, don't we? In the past, so much of this is based on extrapolation. It's only going to be with the maturity of clinical studies, which are a number, the school studies, okay, non-clinical, that's a separate one. Are these going to mature maybe in the next couple of months, and that should provide very convincing stuff. There's a good piece of work, isn't there, that we're presenting at the House of Parliament next week on looking at airborne contamination mitigations in schools, and I think that might be quite valuable to bring to this community. Frank, can you follow up on that?
Yes, certainly. I'm going to be at that event, actually. We are going to be showing them what we can do in hospitals as well, but that's directly to MPs, and hopefully that might be able to help the NHS. But the NHS as an organisation is absolutely massive, and I'm on a number of the major steering groups on NHS improvements and so on. But then when you roll down to the level where the actual hospitals are operated, they're operated through trusts, and each trust is individual, and you have to talk to that one. I think they all do know there's an issue with infection control and ventilation, but they have so many other problems on their hands. I mean, the net zero carbon challenge that's been thrown at them by government is a massive, really, to get their carbon down to zero by 2030. It's a massive challenge, and they're trying to get on with that. Actually, this solution we're offering for infection control can get them a third of the way there, which is fantastic. But it's joining the dots, really. I guess with all they've got on their plate, this is just one issue. But we have got to get that message across, though, Tony.
Yeah. I think you're letting them off the hook a little bit there, Frank.
So to sum up, ultimately then, the focus should be on the value delivered, not price. That's what key players like PRS need to work collaboratively on. And in answer to the questions in the chat room, if we've not answered any of the questions, we will try and answer them directly. PRS have said they will do that. And this recording will be shared further down the line, possibly in about a week's time. And we've got about 2 minutes left to sum it up, guys. Rob, would you like to finish off before Tony and Frank?
Well, I just would like to say that I think that the UVC technology, which I think Catherine Noakes's comment about we did the same thing with water 100 years ago. Well, guess what? We were treating water with UVC almost 100 years ago too. So it's been around a long time. It's time to start using it on air and to make our environment safe to work and live and play in. We need to address all those aspects of where we live with and I think PRS can do that.
Tony?
Yeah, I think tremendous webinar. Thanks, colleagues, for participating in it. I think what IPC really need is good evidence that these techniques are going to work. I think we need to extrapolate from what we're doing for NHS supply chain at the moment in terms of setting a lower benchmark, an upper benchmark for UVC efficacy, and to incorporate very, very soon some of these clinical models that we know are going to be published. And I look very much forward to the Addenbrooke study, which I believe will be published in the next couple of weeks.
And let's leave the final word with Frank.
Yeah, I would. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm an engineer, so I'd encourage you to go to the Royal Academy of Engineering website and download that report and have a look at it. It has good strategies in there for what I call the application side of things. We want to really get things done, make them work, and see the results in practice. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob, Frank, Tony. Been an excellent webinar, and thank you guys for joining us as well. As I say, this will be available again on the Nolex website in the next few days. So if you've missed any of it or you want to share it with your colleagues, then by all means do so. And if you need any further information, get in touch with the guys at info@pathogen-reduction.com. Once again, thanks very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure bringing it to you, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul.